Hey, for Monday, June 29th, 2020. This is the Pro and Con Show, and I am your host, Michael James Ott. Welcome to the show. As always, welcome to the show. So, Pro and Con Show, it's got the name for a purpose, encouraging all of us to be better citizens, because the issues that face us as a nation, as a community, as a neighborhood, or whatever the case might be, a state, region, okay, they're fairly complex, and they're always going to have significant pro and con, good and bad, for and against. And you and I, as good citizens, need to gather that information, both the pro and the con, the good and the bad, the for and against, hence the Pro and Con Show, as I said. So for today's show, it's entitled TIDES. As in, the tides are changing, I think. I hope. All right, so what am I talking about? So, just a little background. I have always been, and you know, I say this show is done without political bias and without religious bias, and that's absolutely true. Now, some of you may watch the show and say, well, that's not true because you're biased against Donald Trump, and that is not, in any case, in any way true, from the sense of, you know, well, I'm a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, and therefore I'm biased against him, or because he's a Republican or so-called Republican, or because he's a billionaire, or any of those kinds of things. I'm not biased at all against Mr. Trump as an independent person, but I know, because I've observed, and if you have taken the time to really think and observe him and understand his history and stuff like that, you end up realizing that he is not a very good person to have as president of the United States. And he at the moment, so I was always worried that he would be kind of inept in the office, because I thought he would get into the office of the presidency and then, you know, flail, because he's used to just ordering people to do things. And I thought that the Republican Party, most of the Republican Party, would not go along with his wild flailings. And the other part of it is, I truly believe, and I've said in past shows, that I think he suffers from early onset dementia. So all of these things, it's nothing overtly attempting to be biased. It's just observation of the truth. It's like the earth is round. Now, I'm sure, and I know that they exist, because I've seen, you know, snippets of, you know, things that they've sent around, but there are people that believe the earth is flat. It's not. It's round. And you know, those people, if I, you know, did a series of shows and I kept talking about why I know the earth is round, they might look at me and say, well, he's biased against us, because clearly in our minds the earth is flat. He keeps talking about why the earth is round, therefore he must be biased. No. There are factual things that are true. You know, the earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. The earth is round. You know, there's a bunch of factual things. You know, gravity exists. If I take a pencil or something and I drop it, it's going to fall to the earth. These things are facts. And while some people, you know, they for whatever reason, mentally they can't arrive at that conclusion, the vast, vast, vast majority of us, especially if we're willing to open our eyes and our ears to the information, you come to this conclusion, for example, that the earth is round, or that gravity exists, or that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Okay? So anyway, back in 2016, tides are changing. So back to that. Back in 2016, in the early days of 2016, so I remember it was back in February 2016, and Donald Trump had announced his candidacy and made his infamous ride down the escalator in New York, and and his poll numbers kept increasing. And he was doing all kinds of things that, for example, if Michael Dukakis or Al Gore or George Bush or any of the normal political candidates were doing any of these things, they would have just been swept aside immediately. I mean, Mr. Trump was just making one gaffe, one huge politically inappropriate gaffe after another, and yet his poll numbers were increasing. And so as I started studying him and looking at him, it became readily apparent to me that he had significant mental issues. And the office of the presidency is a very important place in that structure of government that we have. And I became convinced that he was, and I still am convinced, that he is just totally inappropriate for that job. Now, at the time, he was running against, or ultimately ended up running against, Hillary Clinton, and she had a bunch of baggage too. And I remember having a conversation with one of my brothers, who ultimately voted for Mr. Trump, about Trump versus Clinton and corruption and all this other kind of stuff. But Mr. Trump, and especially now that it was clear to me that he would never be able to handle any significant challenge as president, because he's not a leader. He's not a leader. He is a director. He believes that, you know, whatever he thinks should happen. And I attribute that to the way he was, you know, the lifestyle that he's been raised in, and the fact that he was, you know, rich from the moment he was born, and pretty much gotten his way. The one singular attribute or trait of Mr. Trump that he has that's probably stronger than a lot of people is this trait of tenacity. Tenacity. So Mr. Trump will just, he's like a bulldog. He will grab on to something and he'll just keep mawing and chewing and he just won't let go. That's the only thing that I think he has in his arsenal of strengths is tenacity. But as far as, you know, any sort of moral compass or, you know, intelligence or compassion, or, I mean, there's a whole list of things that you would look for in a leader, and he doesn't have any of them, other than, you know, being tenacious. That can be a very important part of being a great leader. But other than that, whoa, nothing. This guy has nothing. So back in 2016, I said, oh, I gotta try to prevent this guy from becoming president of the United States. Again, it had nothing to do with Democrat versus Republican or Hillary versus Donald Trump or whatever. This guy, you could tell, just like the earth is round, it was obvious that this guy was going to be a bad guy. Okay? And so I started working, which I had been very apathetic up to that point. Didn't really care, to be honest. But I was working to try to stop him from becoming president of the United States. Now, I live in western Wisconsin. Well, it's a two-party system. Mr. Trump was a Republican. They were supporting him in his effort to try to be president. so there's only one other side, Democrats. So I started strongly supporting and working for and volunteering to try to progress the Democratic agenda, especially in trying to prevent Mr. Trump from being elected. And so I did door-to-door canvassing back in the day. And they gave me a list of addresses and stuff like that. And this was the local or regional Democratic Party. They gave me this, and I started going door to door. And they, and I was supposed to have these little pamphlets and stuff and talk about the Hillary Clinton and local Democrats and stuff like that. And I was told before I left, it's like this: these are folks that have voted for the Democrats in the last few, elections or whatever. We just want to make sure they get out and vote, because it's important that they vote. And if we get them out and voting, then Mr. Trump will be defeated. So I went door to door. Well, this list that was supposed to have a high percentage of Democrats that were supposed to be voting for Clinton, as I walked through these neighborhoods and I went to these addresses on this list, I think it was pretty solidly about 40% of them had Trump-Pence signs in their yards. So not only had they decided that they were going to vote for Trump and Pence, they were strongly thinking about it enough that they had basically put behind their past leanings toward voting for the Democratic Party, changed their viewpoint, and were now voting for Donald Trump. And are willing, and we're advertising it actively in signs in their front yards. So now in 2018, I did the same thing, only obviously it's not the presidential election. We had some shift in Democrat versus Republican and stuff like that. And now it's 2020. And now, again, I'm helping the Democratic Party because Mr. Trump, again, because, the earth is round, it's a factual thing. Mr. Trump should not be president of the United States for a second term. It was bad enough he was in there for one term, cannot be in there for a second term. So working hard, talking to people, can't go around canvassing, but we can't call. So we've been calling and talking to people. And part of that, even though it's only June and way before normal canvassing and stuff occurs, we're talking to people, and mostly we're just, what are the issues and what do you think of the current leadership, Republican or Democrat? Don't care. Just want to know. What do you think? Polling, basically. What's going on? What do you think of the issues? And how do you think the current government officials are handling those issues? And so the tide is changing, thankfully, because the earth is round and Mr. Trump should not be president for a second term. And as I have been speaking to, it's just handfuls of people, but it's handfuls of people in these same neighborhoods that were putting the Trump-Pence signs in their yards back in 2016. And I'm speaking to them now. And again, some limited data points, but I'm speaking to them now, and many of them are saying that's an experiment gone awry, or he has turned into being one of the worst people ever, or he's treating this pandemic and absolutely failing in leading us to solutions. He's ignoring it, calling it a hoax. The whole thing with race and racial bias, and the fact that he, fairly often, jokingly or mistakenly, forwards this white supremacist agenda. He did it just again, like yesterday. He retweeted something, a video of one of his supporters saying, Donald Trump is great. I think he's awesome, blah, 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 blah. And, white power. Well, Trump didn't realize that that was in there, but it would seem like he kind of believes it anyway. But in any case, again, just that's another, one little piece of why the earth is round and why Donald Trump must not be president of the United States again. And the tide is turning. It feels like here in western Wisconsin, the tide is turning. And the polls, which I talked about some polls in one of the previous shows recently, the polls are starting to indicate that Wisconsin is shifting. And some of the polls have said that Mr. Biden is now ahead by maybe 8 or even 10 points here in Wisconsin. And I hope that that's true, and I hope it continues to be true because, again, the earth is round, and Mr. Trump should not be president of the United States. Bad enough for one term, not for two. Can't go for two. Can't do it. We cannot do that to ourselves. Okay? As far as the Pro and Con Show, my name is Michael James Ott. Until the next show, bye for now.